pattern. You've got the thrust of the accusations. Remember, this was a former member of the Israeli Knesset, which says a great deal about our democracy, I would think, and debunks in and of itself some of the arguments that you've heard there. So first of all, again, thank you for coming, and thank you to our excellent panel for coming. And second of all, I'm sorry that you've had to come. And I'm sorry that our excellent panel has had to come to, as the title of this evening says, to debunk a myth. Evenings like this would not be necessary in an international community that had retained its moral compass. And so, third of all, I wish we were having this event somewhere else, like, say, South Africa. Just watching that and imagining how an impressionable audience would respond to that, an impressionable and not particularly knowledgeable audience. I think you can understand a little of the dimensions of the challenge here. Now, some people get the accents mixed up, but I'm not of South African origin. I did pay a brief visit there a few years ago, but only once. I spoke to Jewish and to non-Jewish audiences. I did some very brief TV. I did a couple of radio shows. I was invited by the South African Jewish leadership, and I was invited on one particular talk show that they were very wary about me doing. It was a host, who took calls from listeners, and there was concern that the host was very hostile to Israel, and I wouldn't get a fair hearing, and so on. And it really didn't turn out that way. To a lot of the Jewish community's surprise, to my surprise, the callers were, and this was I think 2003, if I'm not mistaken, exceptionally hostile. There was only one remotely supportive caller. The rest were very, very hostile to the fact of Israel's existence, basically, essentially attacking Israel for being here. But the host did give me time to respond and to set out some basic truths that he acknowledged he hadn't been aware of. And I think on the matter of Israel and the apartheid, the pernicious apartheid comparison, as in so many matters in which Israel is increasingly, I think, demonized and delegitimized, many, many people hold to incredibly passionate opinions on the basis of extraordinary degrees of ignorance. They really don't know basic stuff. They don't know, right away, Mr. Bishara, well, the establishment of Israel, I should say the re-establishment of Israel, the belated revival of Israel in the late 1940s, was supposed to have been accompanied by the establishment of an Arab entity alongside us. This didn't happen because the Arab preference was to wipe out the Jewish entity. I think many people who are critical of Israel don't know that. They've forgotten or never knew that Israel was attacked relentlessly from 48 to 67, from the very territories that are today widely internationally deemed to be the root of the conflict. They don't know that Israel has made plain over and over again, as Prime Minister Netanyahu did just a few days ago on his recent trip to the United States, that it doesn't seek to govern the Palestinians. It wants to not govern the Palestinians. And perhaps very importantly in this context, a lot of people don't know that Israel, while it feels it has an extremely strong claim to do so, has not asserted sovereignty, not over Gaza and not over the West Bank, not over the heartland of the biblical Jewish nation, Judea and Samaria. For me, that simple fact knocks down the apartheid comparison at a stroke, if you're aware of it and if you're fair-minded. I don't want to speak for very long, I won't get straight to our panel. I do just want to recall a comment that was made at the last event that I moderated here, and I suspect that many of you were here that evening. That was by the Canadian jurist Owen Kotler, who I actually quoted in a piece that I wrote in the Jerusalem Post soon afterwards. He said, "Those guilty of apartheid attitudes in our region," and I'm paraphrasing, "are not the Israelis seeking survival, but those who discriminate against Israel and push for an Israel-free Middle East." In other words, those who uniquely would seek to deny the Jewish nation of a sovereign state. So again, I'm sorry we're not doing this evening in front of an audience in Cape Town or Johannesburg, but I'm very glad we are doing it, and I'm sure we'll all learn a great deal, and then go off and spread the word. I'll introduce our speakers one at a time, and after their remarks, because I know they'll stick to their time slots, as people always do at these events, we should have time for some questions. We've broken down the subject matter very well. Our first speaker is Professor Gidon Shimoni, closest to me on the panel there, who is the Professor Emeritus at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a past head of that university's Institute of Contemporary Jewry, and also held its Shlomo Argot Chair in Israel Diaspora Relations. He was born in South Africa, where he was a leader in the Habonim Dror movement and chaired the South African Zionist Youth Council prior to his Aliyah in 1961. Professor Shimoni's research interests and publications are in the field of modern and contemporary Jewish history, particularly Zionism, and his publications include a comprehensive work entitled The Zionist Ideology and 2 books on South African Jewry, Jews and Zionism, The South African Experience, and Community and Conscience, The Jews in Apartheid South Africa. Professor Shimoni is currently Chief Academic Advisor in the planning of the new Museum of the Jewish People at Bet Hatzot in Tel Aviv. And he's going to speak on the content of the analogy. What was apartheid, and why it is inaccurate to claim that Israel is an apartheid state. Professor Gideon Shimoni.
Good evening, everyone. Quintessentially, apartheid has 2 trademarks that are unmistakable. One is statutory, that is to say, legally mandatory discrimination based on the basis of racially defined sectors of the population. And the second is exclusion of anyone not statutorily defined as white from democratic electoral rights, all of this in order to ensure the domination of the white minority, as it was in South Africa, over the majority who were non-whites, blacks, and colours, Asiatics, and so on. Now, I think it's very good that we saw that brief YouTube representation of the speech by Azmi Bashara, because one doesn't need here in this audience, because we've not come here to debate whether he's right or wrong, to make a whole list of particularities and say this was in apartheid and it didn't exist in South Africa. But the interesting thing is that Azmi Bashara himself absolutely exemplifies the nefarious fallaciousness of his whole chart. One needs only to imagine, let's say, that in that audience there was somebody who was the equivalent intellectual, because Azmi Bashara is a Palestinian intellectual. I've heard him on many occasions before he fled the country, speaking on a refined intellectual level, which makes it all the more abominable to hear this crass distortion of propaganda that he spouts in that particular presentation. But let's imagine that in his audience there was an intellectual from the African National Congress, somebody like the late Walter Sisulu, for example. He would have to ask Azmi Bashara, tell me, were you banned from hospitals, from going to regular schools, from studying at a university? Were you made to sit on benches that were marked, for those from South Africa, not for Blancas Alien, but for Yoda Alien perhaps? Were you arrested on charges of breaking the depraved racist so-called immorality laws for showing any signs of intimacy with a person across the colour line? Was your family removed from its home, for example, as were colours in District 6, and dumped somewhere else according to the Group Areas Act, or placed later on into some kind of Bantu/Arabstan? None of these things apply to Azmi Bashara. On the contrary, here's a man who not only voted for the parliament of the society in which he lived, but was elected to the Knesset, sat in the Knesset